I think you can start by introducing yourself.
Yep, my name is Faisal, or Mohammad Faisal. This is my long name. I'm the Executive Director of the Center of Reform on Economics, or CORE Indonesia. It's an economic think tank based in Jakarta, Indonesia.
So yourself is an economist?
Yeah, myself, I'm an economist in CORE Indonesia.
What does the economist do in general?
Well, we're doing research and advocacy in the area of macroeconomics, but also we're also doing research, thematic research, sectoral research, fiscal, monetary policies, sectoral like agriculture, manufacturing, trade, and also regional analysis, global geopolitical, geoeconomics, research as well. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
What's CORE's purpose? Mm-hmm. Your institution's purpose?
Well, the purpose why the founder of this institution, found this this institution because the founders, who is also a group of economists, see that many or frequently the approach of economic problems, the solutions for economic problems in Indonesia is not touching the core problem. It's not really answering the root of the problem. That's why the name CORE is actually coming from really core or root, meaning that we really want to contribute to as part of the solutions of economic problems in Indonesia, right from the root of the problems, So, because often the solutions is just based on the political, considerations or popular, popular approach, for example, but not really touching the root cause of the problems.
So your institution focuses on Indonesia's economy and ASEAN and maybe global.
Also global.
And also global.
Yeah.
So let's start with a simple question.
Yeah.
How was Indonesia's economy last year?
Last year, in 2024?
Yeah, 2024, because we just started 2025.
Mm-hmm.
It's too early to say about the economy.
Well, we did actually in November doing research on outlook of 2025, but we can also have a review of last year's economy. In 2024, we predict, until the end of last year's economic growth would be about 5.02%, which is still almost 5%. It is considered slower than the economic growth in the previous year, not to mention in 2022 where we were enjoying commodity boom back then in 2 years before 2024. And in 2024 we faced some challenges, economic challenges, starting from the global economic pressure or dynamics that have an impact on domestic economy, like the slowing down of the commodity prices, for example, because Indonesia is pretty much depending on commodity prices like palm oil and coal and natural gas, etc. Even though we are also at the same time a net importer of oil, of crude oil. We in 2024, if we look back, we also had some challenges in terms of currency volatility, especially in the middle of 2024. Rupiah, is depreciating quite significantly. And that also, of course, has an impact on the business people, especially those who are, have a import, a business, and also manufacturing industry, because many of our manufacturing industries depend on raw materials from overseas, including from China. So that's one of the things I think that we can see from in 2024. Now towards the end of 2024, we also starting to face the slowing down of the economy because of the weakening of purchasing power of the middle income class in Indonesia, and which has happened apparently not just because of the COVID-19 pandemic, but even after the COVID-19 pandemic, because as actually the government has launched, because of the COVID-19 pandemic, for 2 or 3 years the government has launched the economic recovery program. But apparently, the middle class population has been overlooked by these different, various policies. So that's why, until today, starting from last year, the middle income population, has indication, to reduce their spending, basically, because of the weakening of their purchasing power. And that has also had an impact on manufacturing industry, from the production sector, because the orders from the economy, from the consumers, has been weakening, and the contribution of middle income population in Indonesia is quite big, about 84% of the total consumption. Domestic consumptions in Indonesia, especially the private and household consumptions. So that's, I think, more or less some of the highlights of the economy in 2024.
Yeah, speaking of the decreasing population of the middle class, I watched reports about Indonesia's deflation situation. Is Indonesia experiencing deflation? I think
we never had that yet.
I watched news about the worst deflation situation in 25 years of Indonesia.
Oh yeah, of course. Even if we compared with the during the COVID-19 crisis in 2020 and the Asian financial monetary crisis in 1998. The deflation that we experience in 2024 is even longer. About 6 months of deflations. And then if we look at the total inflation in 2024 is lower than the low inflation during the COVID-19 pandemics in 2020 and during the Asian economic crisis in 1998. And the greater contributions of this low inflation or the 6 months deflation is actually the weakening demand of the domestic, domestic economy, especially middle income.
People say that deflation is worse than inflation because it has a bigger impact on the economy. Why?
Well, actually, we cannot simply say that deflation is worse or inflation is worse. It depends on the reasons or the factors behind the inflation of deflation. Deflation can be negative or not good if the factors or the cause of the deflation is because of the weakening demand. Deflation can be good if it is driven by the ability of the government to control the prices while the demand is good. So that's a good thing. But what we had experienced in 2024 is actually the deflation because of the weakening demand, which is not good for the economy because everybody's, especially the middle income populations, started to, reduce their spending. And so that's why it has also impact on the consumption, domestic consumption, private consumption's growth in 2024, which is only reached 4.94%,
So that kind of low spending trend, will that trend continue into this year?
We predict that at least at the beginning or the first half of 2025 this year, I think we still, having that kind of problem. Why? Because to solve this problem, there should be a change in the government directions that focusing on to fixing these middle income class problems. As long as there is no significant and no clear policy directions, to solve this problem, I think the problem will still persist. This year, especially, there may be some changes of government intervention, maybe in the second half of the year. However, we cannot see, quite clearly at the beginning of this year. So that's why I think this will will persist. The problem will still persist in 2025.
But Japan has an even longer period of deflation.
Yep. Japan and Indonesia, of course, has different characteristics. Also has different. Both of us have different stages of economic development. Japan is a developed economy, and Indonesia is a still developing economy. Typically for developing countries like Indonesia, we should have higher economic growth, higher demand, and also higher inflation, which is quote by quote, it's a good inflation because it's different by demand. Japan is a developed country, an aging population. They more or less is rich countries, and usually the economic growth is also very low. And that has, been the case in the last 2 or 3 decades in Japan. And as a result, the deflation in Japan, or inflation in Japan, is very low, even deflation. So that's very typical. The aging population in Japan, meaning that the percentage of productive population in comparison with the non-productive population is lower compared to young countries like Indonesia, for example, which is dominated by young population, millennials, and Gen Z, etc. So it's a different story. So it has also different impact, and so that's why it is not good for developing countries like Indonesia to have a very low inflation, which can also have an impact on lower economic growth.
So people are spending less than before.
Yep.
How to turn around that trend?
Well, yeah. Of course, we have to look at the focus on their income and also living costs. So what happened in 2020, starting from 2024, is actually the real income has dropped, at least for the biggest 5 sectors in Indonesia, which is agriculture, trade, manufacturing, and then and also tourism and construction. So that's the 5 biggest ones in terms of the contributions to the total employment. So the real income has dropped, even minus, negative. And then if we look at also from the savings perspectives, the data shows that the level of savings, for majority of the population in Indonesia also decreasing. The majority of the Indonesian people have saving less. The accounts, the bank account is less than 100 million rupiah. So on average, before the pandemic, the average was about 3 million rupiah per one account. Now in 2020 or last year in 2024, it was just about 1.7 million. So it dropped by about half, of the value in before the pandemic. So meaning many of the population has used their savings, to finance or for their daily cost, for daily cost. So that's say one of the reasons. Also, the government also need to look at how to improve the level of income for the majority of this population, which also means that there should be incentives, productive incentives, for the small and medium enterprises, because majority of Indonesian populations work in the medium, small and medium enterprises, from different sectors. So incentives for small and medium enterprises, and the government also have to manage, the living costs, which means the inflation. What I mean, not the inflation because of the demand, but the cost push inflations, which is driven by government intervention, or in economy we call it administered prices inflation. So, and the biggest part of it, I think, the food inflation, which is very important for the government to make it, manageable, low, and affordable for most of the people, because it will impact very significantly on their purchasing power. So there are two main things I think that needs to be focused by the government, especially the income, the income aspects, because if we look at actually the prices, I think it is more or less more or less manageable. But in terms of improving the income, I think there's still lots of homework for the government,
Can the government give out money to people to encourage people to spend more, like what the United States did during the pandemic?
Yeah, that's the difference between the developed countries and developing countries in terms of the space, the fiscal space to fund, different kinds of incentives. We, Indonesia, do not really have that kind of luxuries that the developed countries like Indonesia, United States, or even China for that matter, I think. So the government really needs to look at different ways, to incentivize the middle income population. One of the ways, I think, apart from that food prices control, is also things like, providing a discount, for example, for electricity for the middle income population. I think that's very, very important. But that also requires money, especially from the state budget.
Well, what's the standard for middle income, the middle class in Indonesia?
Yeah, by this Bureau of Statistics definition, the middle income population are those who spend per person per month about 2 million rupiah.
2 million.
Up to 10 million rupiah. So it's quite a range, a wide range in terms of the spending. Yeah.
But the last year's GDP growth, like you said, 5.02.
Yeah.
It's still lower than the government target.
Oh yes, much lower, because the government was targeting about 5.1 to 5.2.
Yeah, 5.1, I think. But Prabowo's target is about 8% growth.
Right. Yeah.
Is that doable
within the next 5 years? Of course, not in 2025, not directly. But I will not say that it is something that impossible, because if you look at the Indonesian potentials with this, abundant natural resources, I think 8% should be, achievable. But the question is how to achieve that 8% with this current, institution settings, and also different challenges, domestic and also global. I think it's going to be quite challenging, a lot of effort, and will require a lot of investments, a lot of money. So the key to achieve that, high economic growth is that the government needs to attract lots of investments, not just increasing, but like a leapfrogging, much bigger than the current, achievements, and that should focus on very productive sectors like manufacturing, because if you look at the current structure of Indonesian investments, a bigger portion of the investment still buildings, rather than machinery, which is quite different if we compare with other peer countries like China, Thailand, Malaysia. These countries have higher proportion of machinery, which means manufacturing investments in manufacturing sector, which can produce faster outputs, and also value added. And then so that's why I think that's the thing that the government needs to push, to achieve that 8% target within the next 5 years?
We will get back to the investment part later, because that's a very big, important topic for me. And talking about GDP, does GDP really matter? Like, there are other economic indicators like unemployment or employment and trade and other things. Is GDP the most important indicator for a country?
It may not be the most, but it is the first thing that many people or many institutions see if we want to look at the shape or the condition of an economy in a country. So that's one of the first indicator that people will see. So how much is the economic growth, and then how big is the economy, the GDP. So, but that's not. It does not necessarily mean that we only see the GDP only, because there are lots of different other indicators which is also equally important, like inequality, and also a poverty rate, and then employment, of course, and many other indicators. So the question, I understand what you asked that question, because it is very important that the government do not only pursue the economic or high economic growth, but also in terms of economic distributions. We cannot just achieve high economic growth with also high inequality, and that is the challenge. Another challenge, because achieving higher economic growth is one thing. The other thing is how to make that more distributed, equally distributed, and that's for Indonesia. It's also a big homework, because inequality in Indonesia is also a big problem, not only in terms of the income inequality, but also in terms of access, for example, and also asset ownership. It's also something that is really, really unequal, in Indonesia.
Yes, some of the islands are really remote. Underdeveloped. How do help those poor areas to develop while the country's economy is growing? And that's a very big, a tough issue for Indonesia.
Of course, Actually, that's also one of the issues that was become the priority of the previous government in the past 10 years, by developing or boosting the development of infrastructure, not only in Java, of course, but also outside Java. We call it the outer island, which is the other 4 biggest islands, and also the smaller islands. And especially the eastern part of Indonesia, which is, further lag behind compared to the western part of Indonesia. And that has an effect also on the level of incomes in the eastern part of Indonesia, because of, accessibility, because of the lack of infrastructure. So infrastructure is still something that Indonesia needs to, need to prioritize, I think, in order to distribute this, economic levels, among different regions.
President Prabowo has suspended all the big infrastructure projects of Indonesia. Is that a wise move?
Well, that's one of the reasons. I think the government needs to rethink not only achieving high economic growth, but also the distribution of economy. And there is one more aspect that I haven't mentioned. It's actually regional equality, distribution of economy among different regions, because without developing a better infrastructure, especially in the eastern part of Indonesia, it is very difficult, to speed up the economy there, except for some aspects, like, for example, that some regions in eastern part of Indonesia have very high, GDP growth because of investments in the downstream industry of mining, like nickels or copper, for example. But the high economic growth is just concentrated in these certain regions. It's not really distributed. Even within this region, the distributions of wealth, is not really equally distributed among the population. So still, apart from attracting investments, focusing on the natural resources in eastern part of Indonesia, infrastructure is also very important.
Food security and this free meal program is very important for Prabowo's administration. Without the infrastructure, how could free meal and the food get distributed to all the islands?
Yeah, that's true. So the problem with the free meals, it's quite complex. First is the money, the funding. The second one is the modalities and also the procedures, and also how to distribute the money, especially for the eastern part of Indonesia, remote islands, which is still far away and very limited infrastructure. And the third one is about the food safety and other, technicalities, which is also very important. Not only the quality in terms of the nutrition, but also the safety. Because, say for example, if it takes longer to distribute meals because of the lack of infrastructure, that will impact also on the safety, right? So it's quite complex problems. But so that's why, if this really something that the government needs to prioritize, the government really needs to look at these different technical problems, and not only biased towards the conditions in Java, for example, which the infrastructure is also quite good, because the conditions can be so much different, in the eastern part of Indonesia, and that will impact on the quality of the program.
But if you suspend all the infrastructure projects, the big one funded by the government, what about the employment rate? People don't have jobs, and that will limit their spending.
Yeah, that's true. So that's why, in order to provide good jobs, lots of good jobs, Indonesia will need, of course, investments. It's not only big investments, but also medium and small investments, because sometimes big investments is not really labor intensive, but medium and smaller usually more labor intensive and requires less technological requirements, for example. So that's why investments, first of all, so investment is very important, but also, and second one is the government needs to look at the characteristics of different regions if we want to focus on investment. What kind of investments? What sectors, for example? It has to be in line with the advantage of these different regions. What are their, for example, main commodities? What are their advantages in terms of the locations, for example? And by seeing these different characteristics, the government can, I think the government can, attract investment that can provide more jobs, suitable jobs for the local economy and the local people.
Right now, the largest contributor to the Indonesia economy is still the commodity sector.
Yep, at least in terms of exports. Now, I think it's about 55% commodity exports, and then about 45% manufactured goods.
So if Indonesia wants to achieve this 8% growth or the 2045 target, how should the economy transit to another mode? A manufacturing lead mode or another mode?
Yep, I think that is the key. The key sector that needs to be, prioritized is manufacturing sector, and it has to be sustainable, and it has to be consistent over a few decades towards 2045, and there should be good staging, in terms of which manufacturing sectors that needs to be prioritized every 5 years. For example, we do not only talk about manufacturing for domestic industries, domestic market, but also for exports, of course. And for domestic market, we also need to see some manufacturing that import substitutions in nature, because we in many aspects we depend on imported products, so that's why by building manufacturing domestically is one of the ways to provide jobs, to create multiplier effects, and to achieve higher economic growth.
But if you want to develop the manufacturing sector, you need investment. Right now, maybe from China, I see a lot of Chinese factories being built here by big Chinese companies, like the one that's being built in Subang, a BYD factory. We also have wooling factory and other manufacturing companies also here in Indonesia. Talking about investment, one of the hot issues here right now is about Apple. The Apple 16 series has not been granted to sell here, and they offered $1 billion investment, $1 billion investment here to produce AirTags. But that's got declined by the government. Is that a good decision by the government?
Well, there's a story behind that decision, I think, because I've been involved in this research on local content we're talking about smartphone industry in Indonesia, because we're talking about Apple. So I can start from the time when Indonesia first introduced the local content requirement, which is almost 10 years ago, in 2015, and that was driven by Indonesia's massive imports on smartphones. And lots of your foreign brands of smartphones was sold in Indonesia, and resulting in a high trade deficit. So that's why the government will see that we need to build our own industry for smartphone. Probably not the whole handset, but at least some local content. And that's why in 2015, if I'm not mistaken, the decision or the policy was imposed. But then back then, some of the companies comply, some of them did not really comply, and companies like Samsung, for example, complies to that policy, and they built their factory here, and they try to also create the ecosystems. But then of course there are some challenges, like because we don't really have strong enough supporting industries. So that's why even the factory has been built here, it's just a kind of an assembly. So we still need to import the components parts. But that's the first step is okay. But then some of the other companies did not really comply, like Apple. They tried to lobby by just building an innovative center as part of the local content. This innovative center has been built back then, but if we look at what happened in this innovative center, it did not really have links to their supply chain, especially smartphones. It has nothing to do with smartphone production. So, but it has been calculated as local content back then. And now, fast forward, recently, the government want to enforce that Apple, you have enjoyed Indonesian markets and iPhone products, for example. Now it's time for you to comply with the local content requirements. So please build a factory connected to smartphone. So that makes sense when the Apple said that, okay, we want to build factory, but AirTag factory, which is not related to smartphone. And while the regulation is actually local content is for smartphone, computers, and tablets. So AirTag has nothing to do with that. So the government needs to enforce actually regulations to build a local content for smartphones. This is very important because if the government, approve the investment in our AirTag, and that become a bad precedent for other companies, for other investors like Samsung. Oh, why do you give that, exemptions for Apple, not to us? We complied. So that's very important for enforcement, policy enforcement. I said in terms of local content.
But iPhone is, in terms of market share, Indonesia is a really small part for Apple's iPhone series. Isn't Indonesia's government afraid that Apple will just overlook Indonesia's market? And this will set a bad example for all the big tech companies in the US or in China.
If you say that for iPhone, the market in Indonesia, market share for iPhone is quite small. But AirTag is even smaller. If you talk about even smaller,
not so many people buy AirTags.
Not so many people buy AirTag. So the issue is not just about that. Indonesia will be afraid, that Apple will overlook Indonesia, because Indonesia is a very big market. The fourth biggest, most populous countries in the world. So it is very difficult to overlook Indonesia. So that's why I think Indonesia, in this case, has stronger bargaining positions. Not to mention, we have substitutes of smartphones, not only from Apple, but also we've got lots from Chinese products as well, Japanese products, Korean products. So not a big problems,
The iPhone's price here is really, really expensive. It's really higher. It's about 1 time higher than the ones in China.
Right.
And smartphones are really expensive and tablets are expensive. Why is that? It's, also like cars. Cars are expensive here. Very expensive. Like Honda CR-V, it's a lot higher than the ones in China.
Yeah, that's because we impose on luxurious goods tax, higher luxurious good tax for these kind of products. I'm not sure what smartphone, but I think there's some certain of higher tax also for smartphones. But obviously, cars, because this is subject to luxurious goods tax in Indonesia, and the tax rate for these luxurious goods is higher than compared to many other peer countries, I think.
But Apple, I think, why doesn't Apple want to build a factory here?
Well,
in your opinion,
I don't quite know actually. The answers.
All the big tech companies, Apple, Tesla. Let's take Tesla for example. For the last several years, Jokowi, Luhut, they all have met Elon Musk for several times, and Musk also comes to Indonesia. They talk, but no factory being built here. Finally, Tesla chose Thailand. They all build factories like Samsung's investments. It's also bigger in Vietnam than here. Why is that?
Well, if you put that in that context, of course there are some constraints investing in Indonesia and some risks as well. And one of the constraints is actually in terms of the procedures of investments in Indonesia. One of them. Second one is the government guarantee in terms of many things, including policy, availability of land. For example, I remember a few years back, Foxconn, for example, also intended to invest in Indonesia, and then it was just withdrew, and then invest somewhere else. Is a combination of these different factors, license procedures, long procedures, red tape, and government guarantee in terms of lands, in terms of policy, in terms of many other aspects, and also if we look at the case why finally Malaysia, for example, get the investments is because of the readiness of the infrastructure and including human resource. So these combinations of different, factors have impeded Indonesia to attract large investment, especially high-tech investments.
Yeah, I think Vietnam's economy growth last year was over 7%.
Yep.
Yeah, it's really fast, and many tech companies choose Vietnam for investment. And as the largest economy in the ASEAN, Indonesia now is a step behind.
Right.
So many countries, Malaysia, Thailand, and Vietnam. So what's the steps for Indonesia to improve? Like the procedures, it takes about, to set up a company here, it takes over 20 days, 11 steps. Why doesn't the government just streamline the procedures?
Well, the government has tried to did just that, a few years, like 5 or even 7 years ago during the Jokowi's administrations, by building, for example, national single windows, and then some other different, programs
we
to
have
streamline.
That single window thing in all the departments to set up a company in one building. In one lobby, you can just go in and do your thing.
But apparently there are some technical problems, with this system, not to mention the people or the human resource who's supposed to, monitor and control the effectiveness of the systems. So it's still homework. Apparently, it's still some of the impediments for investment, still, the long procedures. So national single window does not really, answer that problems until today. So that's the thing that the government needs to learn, from this, initiatives, and also learn from, of course, other countries like Malaysia and Vietnam. One of the difference between Indonesia and Vietnam is actually we are more decentralized rather than Vietnam is actually more centralized with central control, and the government can really have more power, to enforce the policies, including new systems, etc. This may not be not necessarily good, probably in terms of, say, for example, democratizations, but it's good for investors because it provides investors with certainty, and consistency. And Indonesia needs to learn from that. Indeed, I think if we want to attract more investments, and including high-tech company, that's, I think, also one of the things that Indonesia needs to anticipate, especially with the new administration in America. If we learn from the first period of Trump and has impacted on some dynamics in terms of relocations of investments, including relocations outside China, for example. Vietnam has succeeded to attract that relocations movement, but Indonesia did not really successful.
I think the first reason is because Vietnam is really close to China. Geographically. So, and they have the skilled workers, and sometimes Chinese workers from the southern western part of China. Like the Guangxi Autonomous Region or other regions, they can easily move to
and work there.
That gives Vietnam advantage, but Indonesia also has its own advantage, like its resources.
Of course,
the big market, enough labor, but not skilled labor.
That's true.
That's a problem. But the procedures, so many procedures, and sometimes just one procedure, one step takes much longer time. Like AMDA, AMDA takes sometimes over a year. Why doesn't the government just improve to help the investments to come here?
Indeed, actually, the government has responded to that, but again, it was not really effective enough, because even some of the procedures like AMDAL or environment requirements, license requirements, it has impacted even some of the projects. They do not just need environmental license, which is not good. What we want is actually not to exempt the license, but to make it faster. So that means that that reflects the capacity of the government to make something happen. So instead of to make it right by make it faster, they just dismiss the steps, which is of course not good, because we still need some assessment of environment, assessment of many other aspects in investments. So yeah, again, that's about the capacity of the government to make things happen.
Will this procedures be improved by the Prabowo's administration?
Well,
do you see that happening?
We supposedly with the new administrations and different ministries, because Prabowo has set, different settings in terms of the ministries, including investments and other sectors as well. But then again, the new institutional setups also depend on the person or the human resource or the people, who is in charge with this matter, So that's why Prabowo as a leader itself is one thing, but the ministries level is also very important to make that happen. So the capacity of each of the ministries, including the ministers and their subordinates, will also determine whether they can solve the problem or not.
Yeah, if you can't solve the problems, how can you persuade Apple and Tesla to come here? Mm-hmm. Without them coming, how can you improve the workers' skill? It's a dilemma.
Yep.
It's a dilemma. Mm-hmm. You have to choose. Sometimes I think you have to choose. So I think from China's experience, we can tell that during the opening up and reform and opening up period, from the beginning, China really gives their policy benefit, some of the not so many red tape to help to attract the foreign companies. Especially the U.S. and the European companies to go to China to invest, to help with the country to improve the economy. But I don't see that happening in Indonesia anytime soon. That's a pity, I think.
Well, I think to some extent I agree with that, because that will take quite a lot of reforms in Indonesia institutions and also policy transformation, I guess, and also we need to compete with our peers as well, which is more or less more advanced in terms of the ability or the capacity to attract investors. So that's why this is the big homework that Indonesia needs to tackle.
But your institution is called Reform on Economics.
Yeah.
What's your suggestion What's your advice for the new administration? If you can tell them what to do for the first step, what would that be? To reform the economy.
To reform the economy. Well, first of all, as I said, in terms of the economic growth, the government will also need to look at the ability of each region, to increase the production, the production activities for each regions. Right now, it is not the case yet, because it is still driven by the central government from Jakarta, while Jakarta's approach is quite biased to characteristic of Java. So that's why regions like outside Java, they don't really, quite suitable with the approach with the Javanese characteristics. So that's one of the things that the government need to learn. And the second thing is, of course, the government needs to do lots of efforts in terms of corruption eradications. This is one of the important things if we want to have a reform, including investments, because one of the impediments for investments is actually the level of red tape and also corruptions. It has been, deteriorating, if I may say, in the past administration, with the weakening of the anti-graft institutions like KPK. And this is the thing that the new government needs to reform, to build the trust to investors and also to the Indonesian people, that actually law enforcement and corruption is really one of the corruption eradication is one of really the things that the government really concerned about. Yeah, it's the second thing. And so and then the third thing is also the new approach, in every priority programs that the government has decided. Say, well, the government can have priorities like free meals program or housing programs. Well, any programs, but there should be new approach that the government needs to, to handle that kind of priority. Say, for example, free meals program. Well, the impacts of the program can be different with different approach. If the government also still focusing, for example, only focusing on how to distribute as much as possible meals to as many students as possible, it may be different if the government also needs to look at how much the program also have a multiplier effect economically at the local level, including looking at where is the source of the free meals, for example. Yeah, this is the thing that may be overlooked because the government really focusing on the distribution as well only. So that kind of different approach is very important. The same is true for housing program, for example, because if we learn from the past experiences of housing procurement, many of the houses that has been built, for example, with government money, subsidy, was not really occupied or was not really effective for the beneficiaries because of the locations too far, and they may not be able to to pay the installment, for example. So the new approach needs to be done for this housing programs, because to make sure that the beneficiaries really benefit from the program, and it also answers the needs of the people, because in fact many of the Indonesian people do not have house and they cannot afford houses, so housing procurements is actually is very important.
Do you think it's way too early for the government to start this large-scale social welfare programs?
Yeah, that's one of the things I think needs to be one of the attentions, because the volume or the scope of the programs does not need to be too large, so that it will needs a lot of money. The first thing is maybe just not very large, but it's quite effective, and we can learn from that and can be replicated and expand the coverage after the first implementations. I think that the effectiveness is quite important, not just the coverage, but the current government still, I think, still quite concerned about the coverage, to make it more, amplified, across different regions in Indonesia, So I think that's one of also the important things, including if we talk about the free meals program, that has been, initiated by the government.
During the presidential race, Prabowo says he will increase national debt. Will he do that?
Well,
this year or in the future?
Yes, that's actually one of the important views of Prabowo, because he probably look at the needs of funding Indonesia is very large, to fix the different economic problems, but at the same time overlook the importance of keeping the fiscal performance in shape and safe and also trusted, because by increasing level of debts, massively, it also will reduce the trust of the investors, reduce the trust of business players on Indonesian fiscal capacity, because especially the ability to pay back, the debt. So that's why this is something that I think Prabowo needs to avoid, increasing debts, in a massive amount.
And one of the government's promise is to achieve net zero emission.
Yeah, that's right.
By 2035 or 2060?
2060.
Is that a big promise for the government?
It is. I think, especially if we look at the current achievements of greenhouse gas emissions, there are some certain targets until, if I'm not mistaken, 2025, and realizations until 2023 is still so much below the target. So not to mention the net zero emissions by 2060. So that's why the government really needs to implement new approach of economic development, while at the same time also reducing greenhouse gas emissions. That's why the government now is quite trying to launch the green economy approach, including circular economy approach in several sectors, to make sure that there is still some economic growth, but at the same time reducing the emissions.
But for developing countries, coal is the most productive and effective
and efficient
source.
Yeah.
Is that too much request from the Western countries or the developed countries to ask for in developing countries to achieve net zero emission, or to totally give up coal?
No, I think it is not realistic to give up coal, especially for developing countries. 2060 is a global target, but of course, the capacity of developing and developed countries is so much different. Not to mention, for example, the largest contributors of emissions is actually from the energy, and many of developing countries still depend on brown energy, including coal and crude oil, for example. So the idea is not to stop the use of the brown energy, but rather how to diversify first, phase by phase, diversify to renewable energy, because at the same time, actually, Indonesia also have various source of renewable energy, various source of renewable energy. But the challenge is often for this renewable energy, they need they tend to have a higher cost, initially, but in the longer term, the operational cost is much lower than the brown economy. So again, it's the investments for the initial stage, to bridge that cost problems. And again, that will require fundings, and the capacity of developing and developed countries, of course, different in this case, So that's why the developing countries like Indonesia really needs to find their own strategy, to achieve that. which is not be the same as developed countries.
For this year, you earlier you said you have an outlook on the 2025 Indonesian economy. What's it look like?
So there's some assumptions behind that the government has not really changed the policy direction. The outlook with that assumption is about 4.8 to 5% of economic growth in 2025. So which means that it is not higher than the previous year in 2024. So but if the government, change the policy direction, it is not impossible to achieve higher growth, maybe above 5%, but not in an instant.
What do you mean by changing the direction?
Including one of the things that we have discussed is the problem with the middle income class population. The government needs to fix that problem because middle income populations, contributes the largest in Indonesian consumption and Indonesian economy. Fixing the middle income class problem do not only solve the consumption growth problems, but also the production in the manufacturing industry, because the production manufacturing industry depends on the strength of consumptions. So in this case, not only the private consumption growth, but also investments and also production growth also increasing, and that will leads to higher economic growth.
Your projection includes the factor of the Trump administration?
Oh, the Trump, yes, of course, yeah. So it is not only considering the domestic conditions, but also global, global pressure. We have seen that in 2025 there are some challenges. Even before the election, the U.S. presidential election, we see that some slowdown of the global economy, especially the major trading partners of Indonesia. It will impact on Indonesia's exports performance as well. So that's one of the things. But then again, the Trump factor, because the election of Trump, of course, will slow down the trade growth globally, and that will impact also on Indonesia, and also some other impacts like monetary policy. Say, for example, if with the Trump's government policy, that will impact also on the stronger dollars, and that means that they put some pressures on emerging countries' currencies like rupiah, and of course this is not good for the economy.
Trump's during the election, I think he did a podcast saying that he keeps saying that tariff is the most beautiful word in his dictionary.
Yeah,
and tariff is really powerful.
Yeah,
I think he sees tariffs as a key to everything. Is tariffs that important?
If we look at in general, globally, the main problem is not just tariff, but also non-tariff measures. But I think what Trump suggests is actually from the American point of view, because United States is the world's largest importers. So everybody wants to export to America.
Yeah.
So meaning by putting higher tariffs, that is will put pressures on the exporters to America and give some space for Indonesia to build the manufacturing industry.
But by imposing high tariffs on all exports, all goods, but will that affect America's inflation?
That's true, of course.
The people will pay the price?
Yes, that's true. So that's why that's the thing, that the downside of putting the tariffs in America is the higher inflations, the very thing that the Americans, especially the Federal Reserve, try to fight, in the last, 1 or 2 years, to fighting inflations. But with this new policy, putting higher tariffs, that will impact on higher inflation, meaning that it will, adversely impact the American economy at the end of the day. Not to mention the inflations because of the this restricted immigration policies, because many of cheap workers in America actually migrants from Mexico, from other parts of the world. So by restricting migrations, meaning that they will lose, cheap labors, and that will increase also minimum wage and also increase inflation.
Will the United States pose higher tariff on Indonesia's goods?
I think Indonesia is not the main focus for America, apart from China. In the second administration of Trump, Trump also focused on other countries like Mexico and even Vietnam. Vietnam
Malaysia.
And maybe Malaysia. So because the structure of American trade deficits in the second administration is quite different from the first. The first probably is mainly contributed by China, but in the second administration, also China, Vietnam, and Mexico. So it's more diversified. But in a way, I think it can be an opportunity for countries like Indonesia, which is not part of the main focus for America, by, if we can, to substitute the export market in America. But again, America also put some import tariffs for other countries, including Indonesia. And not only tariffs, Trump also introduced the reductions of facilities like GSP, which is the generalized system of preference, which is actually the facility that is very important for Indonesian exports like textile products. So if the Americans or Trump reduce the GSP, of course it will further impact the textiles industry in Indonesia.
And the Biden administration has just announced the category, I think 3 categories, like for AI chips.
Oh, that's true. Yep. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Indonesia is in the second category.
Yeah,
how will that impact Indonesia's development?
Well, for AI, I think Indonesia is the second and in second layers. But right now, if I look at AI, the source of technology should not be only from America. So, from this current point of view, I think the impact on Indonesia may not be very, very large, because we have also other partners, countries outside America that can we can cooperate with in terms of AI. I think AI also is not concentrated only in America. So that's the thing in terms of the AI, which probably different from the tariffs policy, which is more massively impact other countries.
I'm really confused about the tariff policy. If they impose higher tariff on all exports, on all goods, the American people will just pay higher price for daily needs. Yeah. How will that be sustainable?
Yeah, that's the questions, because this is plus and minus of this policy. The government wants to build a factory, provide more jobs for manufacturing, but at the cost of the consumers in America. They have to pay more.
But if you want to sell to the American, the policy wants you to believe that it's better if you build a factory there. Mm-hmm. So Indonesia has another competitor in terms of manufacturing sector. Yeah, the United States, but it has higher minimum wage.
That's right. Yeah. So it is not competitive because the current wage in America is already very high. So by putting tariffs, in order to build factories and produce a product which is more expensive, significantly more expensive rather than imports, I think it will, very significantly impacted on the American consumers at the same time. So this is the thing that I think Trump, I think, in a way, I predict he cannot just simply implement this policy easily because of these challenges as well.
if that happens, will Indonesia have a bigger bargaining power with the U.S.?
Well, I don't think so.
Yeah, Luhut keeps saying that Indonesia is a big country. You cannot just prey on us or bully us.
Well, it is not that easy, of course, because we're not only talking about economic power, but also geopolitical power. So, in a way, probably things like Indonesia's joining BRICS can be one of the ways, to increase that bargaining positions. So, not as simple as because of Indonesia has a big market, for example, because many occasions in the past, like for example, in relations to cooperations with America in trades, for example, in many cases of disputes in terms of exports and imports, we lose, the disputes with America because of we have weak diplomacy. So that's why it is not easy, because we also talk about diplomatic strength. So again, well, Indonesia also needs to improve its diplomatic capacity as well. Yeah.
So what's your opinion about the BRICS? Mm-hmm. And what are the benefits of Indonesia joining this organization?
Well, I've been saying this for quite a while, because I always think that in terms, if Indonesia wants to join a big, cooperations platform or whatever, it should be something that has similar characteristics to Indonesian economy. And I think BRICS has more similarities, with Indonesia compared to other, cooperations like OECD, for example, because BRICS is not just a collection of developing countries, but emerging developing countries and big developing countries like China, India, Brazil. All of those countries have similarities with Indonesia. So by joining BRICS, we have, first of all, bargaining power, not just because we have all of these countries have bigger markets, bigger, larger GDPs, but also similarities in terms of interests, common interests. Developing countries used to have, quite similar interests compared to developed countries. Some of these BRICS countries are also depend on commodity prices, like Indonesia. So commodity exporting countries usually have some similarities, for their national interest, and many other things, like for example, the needs to build, for example, domestic capacity of manufacturing, which of course different with developed countries which have more technology and funding. So some similarities, I think, common interests, I think is very important, with Indonesia joining BRICS.
But Indonesia is still going to join the OECD.
Yep.
Right.
Yeah. At the same time.
Why is that? Is that a balance between China and the US?
The platform of Indonesian foreign policy is free and active, meaning that we do not take sides. Western we balance, so it's more or less neutral. So meaning that by joining BRICS, it doesn't mean that Indonesia puts some distance with the Western, because America still and Europe is still our trading partners. We cannot just overlook that. So in China also have depend on American markets as well. So the idea is not is actually to be more neutral. Do not take sides, because all of these different countries, Western or BRICS or other platforms, is our trading partners, which is also very useful for Indonesian economic development. And in some others, in terms of geopolitical considerations, it's also very important to neutralize, the areas which also includes the Indonesian interests. For example, in the South China Sea, for example, or in the ASEAN regions, balanced power is very important.
be friends with everybody except Israel.
Oh, except for that's true. Yeah, that's true. Yeah. And that's suitable or in line with Indonesian constitutions as well. Yeah, that's why we do not.
That's also in line with ASEAN centrality.
Oh yeah,
ASEAN ideology.
Yeah, that's true.
So I want to talk about ASEAN. ASEAN is an economic unity.
Yeah.
But is it a strong unity?
We have, if we talk about political culture, we do some similarities. But if we talk about economic aspects, we have some differences, of course. Singapore is a developed countries, far more developed than countries like Myanmar, Timor-Leste is not yet in ASEAN, but it's in Southeast Asia. So economically diverse, but we have some similarities in terms of culture and also history. How strong it is? I think if we compare it with European Union, I can say that ASEAN, ASEAN Economic Community, for example, is not as strong as European Community, because at least European, they have their own currency, which is euro. ASEAN do not have one. Also, in many cases, ASEAN, the intra-trade in ASEAN is not increasing significantly with the establishment of ASEAN Economic Community. ASEAN still, using trade cooperations with countries outside ASEAN, with big countries like China, Europe, and America. So if we look at the intra-trade, if you talk about the how strong it is, well, one of the criteria, I think, is how far that ASEAN push the trades between the countries within ASEAN. Oh, that's right. Yeah.
I have another topic. It's about manufacturing. So Western countries or developed countries, EU and the US, says China is overproducing or overcapacity.
Yeah.
What does it mean by overproducing or overcapacity? For any country.
Well, for overcapacity, meaning that China has more ability to export, their products to any other countries, and with competitive price. Yeah. For some countries like Indonesia, this can be a problem, especially if we talk about the competitions in the Indonesian domestic markets. We have some issues, like in the textile industry, with the increasing of imports, not only legal but also illegal. But part of the problems, this is a part of the oversupply problem. This is also some of the Indonesian government ability, to control the borders. So that's but oversupply in China can complicate because of the price, right? Because many of the products, from China is far, cheaper than the Indonesian price. Even less than half of the Indonesian products price. So that can become an issue, like Indonesia, which have big markets but very low production capacity, and competitiveness.
But China is a global factory. It's a world factory. It's more effective. Its efficiency is better. It's not that the human resource cost the labor cost is lower, but China has it's really high labor cost, but it's just the efficiency is better.
That's true. Yeah.
Is that a problem?
It's actually a matter of our own domestic problem in terms of the production capacity, how to improve the competitiveness. So I don't say that it is wrong for China to be able to produce so many
Yeah.
products with cheaper products. No, we compete with each other. If we want to be, also improve our economy to become competitive, let's do that. Let's do what China, for example, has done with the infrastructure, and with the efficiency, with the incentives, many other things. So that, again, that's the homework, I think, for the government, to make it more efficient and more coherent between different policies, so that we can produce cheaper products.
Yeah. Yeah, I hope Indonesia can do a lot better than last year.
Yeah, I hope so. That's true.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's quite a big challenge, especially.
Yeah.
You're welcome.
Thank you.